Hey everybody, it's Cameron and I'm going to show you my top 20 tips in DaVinci Resolve and stuff. I do live editing streams on Twitch, come check me out there. You can also follow me on Instagram, because I've posted one photo in the past 5 years or so. And it's official, I have Twitter. So you can follow me there. So today's not going to be as much of a top 20 video as it is more of a general recommendations I have for working in Resolve. But we're going to cover tips that'll prove to be really useful for your post process. Whether you're doing gaming montages, real life short films, music videos, or tutorials. Now this video will be a little bit more geared towards the gaming side of things, but even if you're doing real life professional setting type stuff, it'll still be helpful. I also want to point out that some of these tips I've mentioned in previous videos, but I'm including them in this video too because I feel like they're important tips to have. So we're actually going to start in OBS because I'm sure a vast majority of you that do screen recordings are using OBS, and knowing how the media works is crucial to the rest of the workflow. So if you have a powerful enough processor, you can actually record straight to ProRes within OBS. And if you have the Stream Effects plugin, the ProRes encoder becomes available in your encoding settings. And ProRes can actually be recorded in MKV, so if your OBS crashes, you don't have to worry about losing the file. The really great thing about recording in ProRes, if you have that capability, and breaking this down simply as I can, ProRes records on a per frame basis, so it records every single frame individually, whereas your regular X264 or NVENC encoders are relying on surrounding frames to basically throw away information. So while X264 and NVENC can create smaller file sizes, it takes a lot more work for the editing software to essentially debayer and read those files. And this isn't exactly how it works, but think of the editing software having to read 10 frames at once as opposed to 1 frame at a time. That's kind of the discrepancy of workload. An additional reason recording in ProRes is so useful is that because it's recording every frame individually, if you're recording a game that has high complex motion or fast imagery, you're not going to have to worry about pixelation or compression artifacts that you typically get with X264 or NVENC, which I'm sure we've all seen while streaming. Now, of course, ProRes is a recording encoder, so obviously you can't stream with it because the bitrate would be extremely high. Now, the next tip comes from when recording in MKV. Obviously, if you're editing in Resolve, you can't import MKV videos. And OBS does have a remuxing feature to MP4, but it's not the most reliable. It can tend to have some issues writing clean files. And obviously if you're recording ProRes in MKV, then you can't use MP4 because MP4 does not support ProRes. So thankfully FFmpeg saves the day, and you can easily remux MKV files into MOV files in FFmpeg. And I can include the script file that I use in the description so that all you have to do is just double click the file and it remuxes the file for you. This will require you to have FFmpeg installed in your system, so I'll link a video on how to install FFmpeg in the description as well. In order to make this a clickable script, all you have to do is just create a new text document, title it whatever you'd like. When you open it, go ahead and paste the script that I included in the description. Go ahead and save, exit out, and then what you're going to do is rename the extension from txt to .bat, and then boom. This script will also be able to do multiple files, so however many files are in the folder that you're trying to convert videos from, it'll do every single one of them. Now you can place videos inside the folder where the bat file is, and then whenever you click on it, it'll automatically remux them. The third tip is a pretty simple one, but often gets overlooked, is make sure you have the studio drivers of your video cards installed. And make sure you go directly to your manufacturer's site to download the studio drivers and don't get them from Windows Update. And now we can actually jump into Resolve. Now setting up projects in Resolve is crucial, because you want to make sure you have all of your settings correct before you start editing, otherwise you can completely screw yourself over later. Once you have your project open, if you are working with non-ProRes or DNxHD files, so essentially pretty much any MP4 file. One thing that's very common in most editing softwares is when you're editing highly compressed footage, like MP4 files, your playback will be choppy. This is very normal even if you have a powerful PC. And this has to do with the encoding thing I was talking about earlier. But if we have Resolve open, then all our media is poured in. If we go up to File and click on Project Settings, select Master Settings and go down to the Optimize Media and Render Cache section. Hi everyone, Future Tim here. Although not really Future Tim because by the time you're watching this, both recordings are in the past, so both of me are past Tims. I digress. After recording this video initially, Resolve came out with this. So that changed this section a bit because now instead of Optimize Media, we actually have Proxy media. So now we can generate full normal files that are much easier to store and locate that are also easily transferable to external drives for more offline editing. For the rest of this tip, just refer to it as Proxy media. And set your optimized media and render cache format both to DNxHR LB, and depending on if your footage is 1080p or 4K, select half or quarter respectively. Once this is set, you can select all of your media in your media pool, right-click them and select Generate Optimized Media. And once that media is generated, you can go up to Playback and select Use Optimized Media. And now you essentially have proxy footage that you can reference for much faster editing and will save you tons of time in your post process. And the great news is when you go to deliver, Resolve will automatically export with the original footage. There's also a proxy mode that you can toggle right here if you want to set it to half or quarter resolution, similar to how you would in Premiere with playback resolution. The only other setting you need to configure when you use proxy mode is back in the project settings and go to image scaling, and at the bottom you see output scaling. Set it to scale entire image to fit. So if you're trying to render alpha channels and you have multiple layers in your edit timeline, what you're going to want to do is highlight all of your layers that you're exporting and then right click and select new compound clip. That way when you're in the deliver page, you can select just the compound clip and it'll render the entire thing. The way individual clips works in Resolve is it doesn't necessarily look at what you have in your timeline, more looking at what the clip has. So if you set it to individual clips on top of 2 layers, it's looking at it on a per clip basis, not the whole timeline. So when you do this step, it'll see the compound clipped as a single clip. This can often fix a lot of rendering alpha issues. Keyboard shortcuts are absolutely crucial to making sure you're speeding up your process. A couple examples of keyboard shortcuts I find very helpful if we go into the keyboard shortcut customization right here. If we select all commands and type in split clip, you'll see this shortcut right here. I have it set to C because it reminds me of the word cut. And then the other one, we're going to type in auto select. And you'll see all of these auto select / deselect shortcuts that are set to various Alt and Control numbers. So with a split clip and auto select keyboard shortcuts set, when we go to the timeline, we can see the auto select keyboard shortcuts are essentially enabling and disabling certain tracks. And this helps us so when we actually split a clip, it only splits the tracks that we select. So let's just say we wanted to make a cut on only audio to and video to. We could just select these and use our split clip keyboard shortcut, and there you go. Now if we go back into our keyboard shortcuts and type in point, you'll see the select nearest audio and video edit point shortcuts. This can be really useful for your L and J cuts. And then also type in extend for extend edit. And again, you can set these shortcuts to whatever you'd like. Don't use my specific shortcuts just because I have them set to that. Use what makes sense to you. C for cut makes sense to me. Z for extend edit doesn't make any sense, but I use it anyways. So if we use our select video point here and then use our extend edit shortcut, you can see we move the edit point to wherever the playhead is. And you can also change the type of edit point by pressing U by default, and that'll allow you to move the clips differently, as shown here. There's also the enable clip shortcut that I find very useful. If you just select a clip and you press E, you can enable and disable that clip without having to delete it. Now let's say you want to add a fancy transition to your scene, but you don't want to use any of the default transitions that come with the program. What we can do is we can place an adjustment clip in our timeline, and I'm going to make this one ½ second. Now I'm going to place it in the media pool and delete it from the timeline so that we can save it as a template later. Now I'm going to place it in the direct center of the edit point of these 2 clips, and then I'm going to open the Fusion page. I'm going to add a transform node, and I'm also going to add a directional blur. And essentially what I'm going to do is to make a whip transition. And I'm going to set the edges of the transform to mirror, and then that way when you drag past the boundary of the center, it mirrors and repeats indefinitely. So I can set a keyframe here at the beginning, and then go to the end and click 1 frame off on the 12th frame. And I'm going to make this -1.5, and now you can see it does a sliding animation. But we want to take this a little bit further, and we're going to add some blur to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a keyframe on length at the beginning, and I'm going to go to the middle and set it to -0.2. And then I'm going to go to the end and press right for 1 frame off, and then set it back to 0. So now you can see the blur gradually increase and decrease. But obviously this isn't smooth, so we're going to go to our spline editor, and we're going to select both of these that we've made adjustments to, and we're going to click this button to see all our keyframes at once. So let's go ahead and select them all, and I'm going to press F to flatten them, and I'm going to add some ease in and ease out to create some extra smoothness. Now when I play this back, you can see it does a nice smooth whip. And when I go back to the edit page and play it back, it makes a nice smooth whip transition. And that's just a fun little way you can customize your own transitions. And if you wanted to save these transitions and use them in any project that you wanted, you can go ahead and click up here on View and then Show Power Bins. And Power Bins show up in every single project that you use in Resolve. So you don't have to copy templates from one project to another. You can just place it in a Power Bin and open it in any project that you want. We've got the power! Next, we're going to talk about something called the Smooth Cut. And if you have any familiarity with Morph Cut in Premiere, Smooth Cut is like that except on steroids and works in real time. So as you can see in this timeline, I have an interview that I shot. If you play back these two spots, it's obviously a jump cut. But I want to see if I can smooth this out without having to make it a jump cut or by changing the shot. So I'm going to click on my effects library and go to video transitions, and I'll see my smooth cut right here. I'm going to adjust it accordingly. And now you can see the before and after. It analyzes the footage and kind of morphs the two ends together to try to hide a jump cut. You can also play with the smooth cut settings in the inspector as well for a little more fine tuning of the smooth cut. Now this effect isn't magical and it only works in certain situations, so use it sparingly. Now let's talk about some stuff in the Fusion page. If you've been in the Fusion page, you'll notice that there's no opacity node by default, but you can create one. So if we click on the brightness and contrast node, what we can do is we can right click, go to macro and create macro. And the only three things that we need to check in here are input, alpha, and gain. And then we're going to set this number 5 value to 1 on gain. And this effectively sets our max value for the slider on gain to 1, which for our understanding means 100%. Let's go ahead and rename this macro to opacity. So once we set those things, we can go up to File, Save As, and then it should automatically save it in the correct folder. We can go and close this out. Now if we press Shift Space and type in opacity, now we have our own opacity node. Now if we pipe a background into the opacity node, just for an example, and we enable alpha, you can see we have an opacity node. Now let's say your edit timeline is set to 1920 by 1080, but you want to create a Fusion comp that's not that size. The key with background nodes in the Fusion page is the background node the furthest back in the node tree that's piped into the background of your first merge node actually determines the resolution of your Fusion composition. So if you select that background node and select the second tab, you can deselect auto resolution and change your width and height to set your resolution accordingly. And when you go back to the edit page, you can see it's at the resolution that you set it to. This next tip is very simple but has a lot of creative uses, especially for webcam borders. Also, something I forgot to mention in the webcam borders video, you know how we had that white selection whenever we initially rotated our background? You don't need to adjust the size parameter. All you have to do is go to edges and set it to literally anything but canvas. And boom, the white edges are gone. I do stuff wrong sometimes, okay? So let's use this on a webcam border right now. Let's use Shift Space and type in Displace. And when we pipe that in front of our webcam border, we're going to add a fast noise as well and put that into the foreground of the displacement. Now if we select our fast noise and press 1, it'll open it up in the first viewer. And now we can change the parameters of the fast noise, and you'll see as we adjust the fast noise, you can see it's creating a pattern or a distortion effect in the webcam border. And we can adjust all these parameters and do some pretty crazy things with it. And if we add some seethe rate, this will allow us to enable some sort of animation with it. Now we're going to talk about how to create a snapping grid in Fusion, because by default, there is none. So usually when you draw a polygon mask like so, you draw it, but there's not really a way to snap it into a certain place that you want it. What we can do is we can create a new background node. And what we're going to do with this background node is set it to white and put it in our first viewer by pressing 1. Disable auto resolution and set the width to 16 and height to 9. What we're going to do here is go under options and go to show pixel grid. And then we're going to controls and then snap to pixel. Now if we pull up the mask, it'll show up in the first viewer, and you can see we can snap to each point in that pixel grid. You can also change the resolution of your background node that you're using as a pixel grid to pretty much any variation of the aspect ratio that you're using, which in this case is 16 by 9. So we can change it to 48 by 27, and that gives us more snapping points on our pixel grid as well. If you want to create some 3D text, it's actually very simple to do. When you're in Fusion, you're going to go ahead and add a renderer 3D and pipe that into your media out. And then behind that, we're going to add a merge 3D. Now in this merge 3D, if we press 1 and open it into the first viewer, you'll see we actually have a 3D world. So let's go ahead and add a text 3D node onto that. And we'll put in some text here. And we can navigate through this 3D environment by a combination of holding in your middle mouse button, holding Alt, and scrolling. So in your text 3D node, if you scroll down to extrusion, you can see the extrusion depth parameter. And if you drag that up, you'll already see the 3D text beginning to form. So we can also add it in the spotlight if we want to. So we can go into render 3D, and under lighting, we can enable lighting and shadows. And on the viewer, we can go to 3D options and also enable lighting and shadows there. So as we move our spotlight, we can see the light changing on the text. And on the spotlight, we can change stuff like cone angle and penumbra angle to change how wide and how soft the light is. So we're going to push this 3D text back in space a little bit. You can rotate it and do pretty much whatever you want with it. You can also add a little bit of bevel if you want to add some fancy flair to it. And you can rotate your spotlight as well. And you can really add a lot of flair to this 3D text pretty easily. And if we want to add even more extrusion, all we have to do is just type in manually, and we can extrude it even farther. You can also pipe the renderer back into a regular merge node, so you can place it over any 2D content that you have in your composition. So we touched on it a little bit before, but let's really go into the spline editor to see what we can do with this. So let's say we have a lovely blue box that we want to animate. So I can set a keyframe on the center here and drag my timeline bar back to the beginning and then bring this off screen. So now I have an animation that comes from off screen into the center, but I want a little bit more than that. So I'm going to set 2 more keyframes. I'm going to set it to go past the center point about this far, and then the second one about this far, kind of offsetting the distance. So now I have this kind of jagged, weird looking linear thing, but we can kind of see the idea of what's going on here. So now if we pull up our keyframes in the spline editor, we can click on this menu button right here and click shows only selected tools so that only the node that we select shows up in our spline editor. And we can select this button that says zoom to fit, and that shows all of the keyframes in our window. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight all of these. And what we can do is we can press F, and that'll flatten all of the keyframes and add a standard amount of ease. So allow each keyframe to ease in and ease out. And if we press T, we can bring up our ease in and ease out parameters as well, and we can adjust those accordingly. So let's go ahead and set each of these to 50. And now when we play it back, you can see it has a much smoother bouncing animation. And some additional things we can do is if we highlight them all and press and hold Shift and drag them, we can drag them across the timeline without adjusting their value. But we can also click on this time stretch tool. And now if we drag this white bar here, we can speed up or slow down all the keyframes without having to adjust each individual keyframe. So now when we play it back, the animation is slower and smoother, but still behaves the same way. Some other useful tools are set relative, which will repeat the same keyframe pattern indefinitely from the last keyframe. So instead of reverting to the same values, it starts at the last value and just sets each keyframe relative to those values it had before. So it's really useful if you want a continuous animation that's not necessarily looping. You can also set it to reverse, which will do as it says and flip-flop all of your keyframes, which can be really useful for outro animations. And you can set it to ping pong, which will enable your animations to go back and forth continuously. Then there's set loop, which loops the animation indefinitely. So unlike relative, it loops the exact same animation you had before without changing the position. You also have your step in and step out keyframe selections, and one keyframe goes to the other without any animation. This can be useful if you don't want to set multiple keyframes for instant changes in values of keyframes. And also by pressing Shift L, it'll set your highlighted keyframes back to linear. So those are some fun little tips in Fusion. Hopefully they're helpful. Now let's move on to the color page. So one thing I like to do in my color correction / grading process is setting up a node tree. And node trees are based on personal preference, but here's how I like mine set up. So I usually divide into 3 or 4 layers. The first layer being stuff involving color space transforms, which I'll get into in a bit. My second layer involves anything with colors or color correction. And my third layer involves exposure adjustments. And you can label your nodes here to know which ones are doing what. So even though in my process I do exposure adjustments first, I usually pipe the color correction parts of it before the exposure because it gives me a little bit more fine-tuning and flexibility with the color because I'm adjusting it before exposure, not after. So my color adjustments aren't going over top of a highly contrasted image. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. And if I use a 4th layer like so, usually it'll be something like using qualifiers or masks, just some fine-tuning adjustments that I might want to put on just to really sell the look. Now one node I find really useful that is kind of underutilized and not many people really explore is called the outside node. So right here I have a mask set up so that when I do adjustments here, you can see it's only affecting what's inside that mask, and then I have my outer borders to kind of feather it so it doesn't look too sharp. And when you set it up, you'll notice that they're connected in both pipes. So let's go ahead and add a mask onto this first one. And right away, when you look at both of the nodes, you'll notice that the first node has the mask that we see and the other one has the opposite effect. So let's go ahead and just add a little bit of gain to this first one, and then let's take away some gain on the second one. And now you can see it almost creates this nice vignetting effect without looking like a vignette, and it really draws out the center of it a little bit more while being subtle. It's a really nice effect to have if you're just trying to emphasize the subject a little bit more. This outside node also works with qualifiers. You can also track masks on the color page, and this can be a really powerful tool, and the tracking resolve is actually very good. So let's go ahead and set up a mask here on this wonderful rock. And as we're on the first frame, let's go ahead to the tracker page and then just click this track forward button. So as you can see, it did a great job just staying on the rock the entire time. Let's just say I wanted this rock to glow for whatever reason. And you can see as I skim back and forth, that adjustment stays perfectly. So you can key and mask stuff out in the color page. And I've already created the mask right here for this little Rocket League clip because I'm so good at the game. So what we'll do is we'll right click in the node tree and click add alpha output. And then we pipe the blue into the blue. The big blue. So with a combination of power windows and qualifiers, we have this alpha-matted clip. And to test this, we're just going to go ahead and throw some sort of rainbow color underneath it. Now we can play it back and see that it looks perfect. And you can also render that out as an alpha channel as well. So for our final tip, we have the color space transform. Now this one effect can be an entire video all in itself. So I'm not going to go into great lengths of detail about it, but I'm going to show you why you should always be using this effect instead of a LUT for your preliminary grade. Essentially, LUTs should almost never be used until the end of your grade to define the look. But for a correction aspect, there's a couple reasons why LUTs are not as effective. 1, LUTs are destructive, and 2, color space transforms are much more mathematically accurate. Now what do I mean by destructive? I mean I completely destroyed this tip and needed to re-record it. Me again, I hated the way I explained it all the first time around and didn't really make much sense of it. So, I had a lot of tired, what can I say? So a LUT is destructive in the sense that it's looking at particular color values and changing them to other color values. But the color space and gamma you're working in doesn't change. So the values that you've maneuvered and pushed around have essentially lost data. It's doing what I like to call dumb math to change pixels from one color to another. So this can get you close, but it never has the accuracy of what a color space transform does. So I conveniently had a Sony S-Log2 clip that I decided to pull in here just to show as an example. So I have a clip that has a custom design LUT that takes into account shooting 2 stops over for S-Log2 on a Sony. I have a LUT here that's the built-in LUT for Resolve, the standard Sony S-Log2 to Rec 709, and I have the color space transform that's going exactly from what I shot in to Rec 709. And don't worry about the tone mapping and gamut mapping for now. This is something I'll probably cover at a later time. It gets too convoluted at that point. And just for reference, this node here is in fact compensating for the 2 extra stops, so I just brought the offset down to 8. That's all this node is, and I'm doing that for these 2 adjustments since they don't compensate for the 2 stops over, but this one does. So that's why I'm not piping that through here. So let's pipe this custom design LUT in first. It does an okay job at changing the color values to look somewhat pleasant, but isn't quite really the look that we're going for, and it has a little bit of inaccuracy in some of the green and brown areas. So let's go ahead and pipe in the LUT that was built into Resolve for this. So as you can see, we got colors to look like a little bit more natural, but we lose a lot of that color information, which we can probably pull out with some saturation. And it does an okay job there, but we're still not quite getting there. And then we can go ahead and pipe this color space transform in. And right away you can see all the colors are almost exactly where we would want them in a natural look. And we have a much better starting point. The reason this stuff works is because Resolve is doing precise mathematical adjustments, taking the exact color space and the exact gamma that we shot in, and changing the physical color space and gamma to the standard Rec 709 format that we all see on our monitors, that you see on Twitch and YouTube. Rec 709 is essentially the standard for video. And this works with virtually anything that shoots in a log or film type format. Now the reason this is also crucial is because if you can change your color space and gamma, you can change it from Rec 709 to something else that you would prefer to work in as well. The key thing is you always want your final output color space to be Rec 709, unless you're delivering Rec 2020 or you're delivering to a visual effects artist for whatever reason. But generally speaking, Rec 709 is what you would want. Now even with this video here, I could do something as simple as going from what I shot in straight to Rec 709, or I can even switch to a different workflow if I wanted to work in RE log C and grade from there. Even though it's still really flat, it gives me a little bit more leniency. Leniency. Is that a word? So if I just added some contrast here, I have a little bit more control over where that contrast is going to be applied. But it still looks like the way I want it to. But if you notice, I already have a node tree set up here, and I have a particularly interesting form of color space transforms here. I have one here that's going from what I shot into Asus AP1 color space and the linear llama. Wow, the linear gamma. And then I have that changing from Asus AP1 and linear down to Rec 709 and RE log C. So because color space transforms are non-destructive, I can either go through one form of color space right here, but I have a similar process here going an extra step from these points and then these points to Rec 709. Even though there's an extra step, the beginning and ending are exactly the same as this. So if I pipe this in, you'll see absolutely no change in the image. So what this allows us to do is actually work in what's called the linear gamma. And what this does is it changes your gamma that you're working in to 1.0. And you've probably heard of the 2.2 gamma or 2.4 gamma on your display. This is talking about a straight line of gamma, something that's not physically possible for your display to show all the information for, but it can read all of the data. And this is essentially how your camera initially records data, but it conforms it to a video gamma, and it's something that your display can make much more sense of. So for example, if I just enable this one going straight to linear, it looks like everything's crushed and nothing makes sense. But this is because it's attempting to display a 1.0 gamma, which our displays aren't physically capable of displaying that entirety of information. However, if I output it this way, so that I can see this stuff and everything that makes sense, I'm going to switch my window here so you can actually see what I'm doing. So watch what happens to a waveform when I just make a simple gain adjustment. The exposure moves in this particular way because this is a simulation of how cameras actually increase and decrease exposure in camera. So if you wanted to get precise exposure adjustments before you do the rest of the preliminary grade, this is how you would do that. I had this whole thing explained to me by a close friend of mine that I should probably have on a video at some point, but this is an incredibly powerful tool that once you learn how to utilize it becomes a very critical part of the color grading workflow. I hope that sums it up. I'm not sure if it did. Let's just roll the rest of it. Oh, okay, so that's 20 tips. I'm about brain dead. Trying to compile all this. Oh no. There goes another thing. There goes another thing. There goes another thing. There goes everything. This was a lot of information to cover, but hopefully at least most of it made sense. And if you have any questions about anything I talked about in this video, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer your questions. And once again, I stream on Twitch. You can find me there, set your notifications on so that you can catch me while I'm live and ask me questions there too. I usually stream Resolve. If you want more top videos like this, and if you have anything specific that you would like me to cover, please let me know in the comments as well. I know quite a few people are probably wondering about particles in Fusion, and I would have covered that. However, Patrick Sterling has been making incredible content on Resolve, and I highly suggest looking at some of his Resolve tutorials, especially the ones on particles if you're into that. Especially this one where he made a 3D hologram using particles. Really great guy making really solid content. Well, Oh, that's it for me. This is Camera Tim signing off. Tip 21, make outros.